Welcome to the Black Writer Studio, a podcast presented by the Hurston Wright Foundation and hosted by Dr. Khadijah Ali-Coleman. The Black Writer Studio is dedicated to showcasing Black writers who are transforming the world today with their literary pen and creating a legacy for the culture. Tracey Michae'l Lewis-Giggetts is author of the dynamic book Black Joy: Stories of Resistance, Resilience, and Restoration. She is a professor of English and Black Studies at the Community College of Philadelphia and the founder of HeARTspace, a healing community that uses storytelling and the arts to serve those who have experienced mental, emotional, and physical trauma. As a writer, Tracey has published 15 books, including several collaborations with numerous high-profile authors. In 2016, she was honored by SheKnows Media as one of the Voices of the Year for her nuanced and personal exploration of mental health, PTSD, and self-care. Tracey has work published in print and online publications such as O Magazine, The Washington Post, Essence Magazine, The Guardian, and the 2021 book, You Are Your Best Thing: Vulnerability, Shame, Resilience, and the Black Experience, edited by Brene Brown and Tarana Burke. Tracey, you have written this book that has really taken a life of its own because it speaks about something that we know it becomes a catchphrase: Black joy, Black joy, Black joy. But it's not until we get into the crevices of your book that you're deconstructing what that can possibly mean through a series of essays. So I wanted to read what I came across on the internet, which is called the elevator pitch for your book.
All right.
And you let me know if you wrote this. But
Okay.
Black Joy: Stories of Resistance, Resilience, and Restoration is a collection of 36 intimate personal essays that will not only demonstrate the nuances and complexities of Black joy, how it's been an ever-present but often hidden stabilizer for you personally, but it will also show how joy survives and thrives even while living above, beneath, and alongside the trauma that comes with living in the Black body. Mm-hmm. Wow. Now did you? Okay. So as I'm reading that, I'm getting goosebumps. The trauma of living in the Black body. So I would love for us to really unpack that, because there's a story in there as to how you came to even deciding that this was going to be not only, you have a series of essays that compile this book, but how did that writing journey start? Was there any type of genesis moment that really ignited this conversation that you begin to have through your writing?
Yeah, I think it began long before I even thought that this was going to be a book or an essay.
Mm-hmm.
I am I had been wrestling with grief myself and trauma, and I going through therapy. My therapist asked me a very pointed question that I couldn't answer, which was, what does joy feel like in your body? And the big age of 40 something years old, I could not answer her. I knew I'd experienced joy. Of course I had. I couldn't have lived this long, right? But I couldn't locate it. I couldn't locate joy in my body. And so that began a journey for me of trying to figure out what joy felt like, and being very intentional about creating the opportunities for joy to show up. And from there, I wrote an essay right after George Floyd's murder, that was wrestling with this idea of grief and how it shows up in our parenting. And it was for the Washington Post. It was a piece on Black Joy as Resistance. that came out of an experience I had with my daughter, where we ended up dancing in our backyard, and this, Gen X versus Gen Z battle that we were having, and then but my acute awareness of the joy, but also the perceptions of other people in our neighborhood who may not have liked to see two black girls, getting it in or anything.
Mhm.
And so balancing that duality and thinking about how this joy moment was living very much in my body. I could feel it. I knew at that point, what it felt like, but there was always this hovering of something else. My own grief, but also it was a contentious election season. So what was going on in the world? We, again, um, George Floyd had just been murdered, and so there was so much in me, and it got me thinking about how we often think of joy as something we have to go find or we have to go get, and in just reading and thinking about our ancestors have always known joy. It's about our birthright. It's always been present, and they knew how to balance, or not, balance is not the word I want. They knew how to call up joy even when the circumstances were the worst they could have, seemingly be. And
Mhm.
so I wrote the essay turned into this opportunity to do this book. So that's sort of the long kind of route, but it really was me doing the work on myself, being aware. Then of course, all of what comes from me, at least as a writer, comes from this personal engagement that I have with whatever it is.
Right. And you've written some books. This isn't your only book. This isn't your
Right.
first book. You actually are the author of 18 books in
Yeah.
total, right?
Hmm.
Correct?
Correct.
So so what exactly about this book would you say kind of opened you up, or required more or something different from you than these other books? I
Hmm.
mean, you're quite a prolific writer, so there's something to be said about this book, which seems to tap into something that was way deeper than anything surface. Like this topic and the way that you approach it is from a very deep emotional, psychological, and spiritual perspective. So what did it require of you differently than as when you wrote your other books?
That's a very good question. I think, I out of those 18 books, there's poetry collections, there's fiction, there's some nonfiction, there's collaborations because I'm a ghostwriter, so I've worked with some folks um and putting their work out into the world. But with this book, it was very different. It was a pivotal moment, I think, in my personhood and who I was as a Black woman, as a mother, all of those things. It's a critical point in time. It was a critical point in my grieving process and the loss of my family member to racial violence in 2018. It was after a severe illness. It was like this perfect storm of understandings that I had about myself and my life, and the life I lived, the life I wanted to live, my healing process and all of it. And so I always say that in writing Black Joy, I was probably the most free that I've ever felt. I was most liberated on the page. And there was something, not to get too woo woo, but like I felt like that I was writing for me, and I was writing about this topic, and I was bringing to bear all of those things that I'd learned as a writer, through Hurston, Wright, through like through every all of the things that I'd done in my life as a writer. But then there was something else at work, and there was
Mhm.
someone else speaking, right? And so I think
Mm.
about my grandmother, I write about my grandmother and my great grandmother, and these voices that were part of the work. And so I think that's the main difference. Like I decided when got the deal, and saw that what this was going to turn into, to put aside Professor Tracy, put aside everything that I thought I knew, and just to be free. and write the stories that I needed to write for my own healing, but hopefully that someone else can say, "Oh yeah, word." Like I didn't know anybody thought that same way. I didn't know that someone struggled with grief and joy and what it looks like, or remembering the memory of their first love, or all the things that I talk about in the book. And so hopefully
Mhm.
that comes across.
That's so interesting because it seems deeply spiritual, and that's not woo woo for me. That's up my alley. But
Okay.
what I find most interesting is that the topic is of Black joy, but it comes from a space that's everything but, but
Yeah.
and during a time that's everything but joyful, but
Exactly.
yet that's what has, it's like you're pulling from that which it's very interesting to me. What I also find interesting is that the bulk, and correct me if I'm wrong, the bulk of the essays were written during this span, this time frame, as opposed to being a collection of essays pulled from different time periods of your life. Am I correct with that, or would you
Yes,
say?
well, so I would say the majority of definitely were written during this time period. There were probably, out of 36 essays, maybe mm, maybe 10 that existed in some form, but I returned to those essays, I think, with a different eye. There were a few there that were previously published, one in Essence, another one in Catapult. And so there were some other places that a few of them lived, but a big chunk of those essays, you're right, came from that. And I just want to like address something, because you were saying that it's interesting that like the trauma, the pain, and the struggle was what this conversation and this writing from Black Joy comes out of. And I think
Mhm.
if that is by definition what Black joy is. Like joy itself is a universal, experience. It's the dopamine and the adrenaline when we experience pleasure. Everybody, every human being, Black, white, or whatever, has it. What makes, and then, I get the question from folks that are like, well, why is it got to be Black, and why you got to make it about race?
Mhm.
Because there is a very distinct experience culturally, historically, that we have, that makes it so that our joy, that universal experience that we have as human beings, lives in this container of other stuff that
Mhm.
is a result of the transatlantic slave trade and Jim Crow and all this transgenerational stuff that we experience even to this present day. That's why the Black on it matters. Black joy
Mhm.
is a thing because of that distinction.
Mhm. Okay, so I'm trying to keep myself together because that I'm recalling watching an interview that you did with Kesey Layman.
Yes, Elaine. Yeah.
I always
Yeah.
jack his name up. Um and I cried when I watched it because he said that one of the things that he would often do to he would push his body to exhaustion, is compare how he's living to his ancestors who were enslaved. And if they could do it, then if he saw no reason to have excuses as to why he couldn't just exhaust himself, to and which is so often the narrative for many Black people, more likely to die of hypertension, more likely, to have diabetes, and just so many health ailments that are largely connected to stress, largely connected to just poor self-care and the things that we do, um, just to be while still considering ourselves functional.
Yep.
So when you break it down as this Black joy is in direct relation to the experiences that we have, the historically oppressive and disenfranchising behavior um,
Yeah.
towards us from other people. It gives context to what it is, that it's not just a catchphrase or hashtag, but it's connecting this ability to find or to have this experience in spite of.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that I would like to know when we speak of in spite of, I don't know if our watchers and listeners are aware of the many hats that you wear, But one of the things that you're very public about is just this love and that you have of being a parent. You often showcase your relationship with your beautiful daughter. And um, you say that a lot of the work for this book was inspired or came from your experience as a parent. Can you talk a bit about that and how parenting played into the expression that's found in this book?
Yes, I can. I love that question. I don't think anybody's asked me that question. I love that. Um, the thing is, there's something about having a little mirror following you around the house. There's something about, and even more so, she looks exactly like me at the age that
Wow.
she is, so it is a kind of inner child engagement where I am now engaging with this version of myself. And she is absolutely her own person. She'll tell you she's her own person. But there is, I think, where the work, as I began to do my own work, and as I began to understand that some of the things that I said and did and even wrote about um, were a result of these parts of me, these younger parts of me showing up on the page, showing up in relationships, showing up in as a teacher, all of those kinds of things. And all the things that that younger version of me had to do to feel safe. Um, and and so my daughter she calls herself a free black girl, and she has this way of being that feels to me like this free version, this liberated version. Because I try to, because you know better, you do better. So whereas my mother and my mother's mother may not have had the information and the even the time or the resources or accessibility to be able to give a certain amount of emotional freedom, psychological freedom, physical freedom, I can
Mhm.
give that to her. And
Mhm.
watching how she engages with that, how she experiences joy, which is very different. Um, I come up with in a time, where we go into certain places and certain spaces. And as little black girls, we had to carry ourselves a certain way, or stop all that noise. You're being too loud. We want these white folks, saying, that kind of space. And now when we move into spaces, I have to fight against that inclination to tell her, be quiet, be quiet, and we do
Right,
talk about
right,
boundaries, right?
right.
But that is just an example of me seeing what freedom, what liberation looks like in this little black body of hers, and wanting to nurture that and wanting to even experience it through her. So when she wants to break
Mm.
out in whatever the Gen Zers do nowadays, and then I hit my cabbage patch and we're dancing, and it's a way for me to tap back into a place that didn't get that kind of freedom at the time in 1980 such and such or 70 such and such, right? So like my journey with her as a parent, and like again trying to resist some of the messages that I don't want to pass down the line, and also wanting to give her some of that joy that I know from my
Right,
grandmother, my great grandmother. So it's not always this notion of transgenerational trauma passing, but like
right,
passing down the joy and passing down the good cultural stuff, what meaning,
right.
the hair, whatever it is, and giving her that, and giving her that in full. That to me really was a turning point for me to be able to write differently, even to write about
Mm-hmm.
joy differently than I may
Mm-hmm.
have prior to having her.
Right. It sounds like it's a level of intentionality that didn't really exist before, where if it happened, it happened,
Right. Yes.
and but you're going about the work of memory making, and so it's intentional. So this is a memory, and when we even think of memory making, a lot of times it's reflecting back and having to pull back the dusty corners of our memories. Is not always something that's up front, but what you're doing and what you're saying is that it's possible to be intentional about it, and for it still to be authentic and genuine, and to really aid in our healing. So that's just powerful overall. When you as you know, this book, many people, I've seen so many testimonies from folks who have read it, how it's been transformational for them. What did you have any intention when you wrote it? Anything in particular that you wanted folks to walk away knowing? And I get the sense that this book is really for Black readers. But correct me if I'm wrong. If someone who is non-Black reads this, is there something, a different experience that they're to have, or more insight, or is there something particular, a particular audience that you wrote this for and that you wanted them to walk away feeling or knowing?
Yeah. So first and foremost, I wrote it for Black folks.
Mm-hmm.
I did. I wanted it to, if I had an intention, I wanted it to be one of those books that we just keep coming back to, that we keep talking about, right? Like, Sister Outsider with Audre Lorde, like the ones that just keep, every now and again you might, open it up and read an essay, that kind of thing. Because what I hope is that there's an ongoing conversation about joy in our communities, in our group chats with our girls, with our family members, with our children, because of the environment in which we have to live. I feel like we do have to be intentional, and we have to um have those conversations out loud with each other,
Mm-hmm.
and there's an
Mm-hmm.
awareness. So the book is three movements: Black joy as resistance, as resilience, and as restoration. And that's very intentional, because while yes, we need to know that we're defiant, when we choose to sing in the middle of a protest, or laugh when people don't want to see our joy. I also want us to know that's only one part of it, that there is this bounce back that we do, there is this healing that we do. Um, and so if there's, what I want people to get from it is like, what does joy feel like in your body? That's the question that my therapist asked me, right? Like, I want people to know that their hands start to tingle, or their stomach gets a little warm or something, and have this connection, this somatic connection to their body,
Mm-hmm.
and then be able to wield it and be able to
Mm.
use it as they need to use it. So that's like
Mm-hmm.
the first intention. And with the second being, and then I want you to tell everybody, and then I want you to, to have this as like this book on your shelf that you refer back to constantly. Now, to the second
But
part of your question, here's how I answer that, because there have been a nice amount of white folks who have read the book and have enjoyed the book. How I answer the question is this: every year in our old neighborhood where we used to live, there was a Greek festival. And me, my husband, and my daughter, especially when she was real little, used to love going to this Greek festival. I mean, the baklava, like all of the food that they would have, the dancing or whatever. Now, when we got to the festival, we would certainly eat the food. We certainly enjoyed the show. We love watching this particular culture celebrate themselves. We didn't jump on the stage. We didn't, go behind the counter and tell them why their food, might be too fattening or too sweet. We didn't center ourselves in their celebration, right? But we enjoyed it, and it was fulfilling. And sometimes we would even take something from it, like, oh, you know what? The next time we have our event, we should do such and such. We even drew from it, but we didn't take from it. And I think there's a difference between drawing from something and taking from it.
right,
And so
right.
that's my request, or my hope for anyone who don't identify as Black, right, are not Black, who are reading this book. You draw from it. There's certainly universal lessons there around joy that you can take from it, but you're not centering yourself in the story, because this is about a very particular experience. So
Mm-hmm.
I always worry about saying that, but like
Mm-hmm.
that's how I feel.
Right. I've never asked that question before. until I was reminded by Toni Morrison, by that infamous clip that I watch it on repeat. I love it so much, where
Yes,
that woman asked her, have you ever thought about writing about white characters?
right.
And she, oh my gosh. So
You read her
whoever's watching
filth.
it, if she read her for filth,
Yes,
but it came to mind for that, because I've been asked with my own books in plays that I've written, that have centered women. I've had men, when are you going to include men? And so, but I know that you've probably experienced that before. But I also, just recently visiting Twitter and seeing it's a book that's out, Black and Bougie, and a lot of the
yeah,
the criticisms. And in addition to you being an essayist, you're also a scholar. And so I can imagine now, with the popularity of this topic, and I think it's been maybe a hashtag before, but you really giving some depth and substance to this discussion about Black joy. I definitely can see this now being something that's entered into the scholarly space, right?
yes,
It definitely is a different take when it's from the voices of Black people, where then it begins to be uh, um, scholarly observation or
yes,
research approach to it. And
yes.
so I say all of that to say, um, do you see you continuing to discuss or to write about this and broadening it from more of the essay stance, where it's more editorial,
Mhm.
more personal, to something where it can be something that you deconstruct from a scholarly space? Is there a fine line from that? And do you see that opening up now for those who are non-Black to then begin discussing this?
Um, I don't. It's a very good question. Um, I don't know if I personally will take sort of an academic or scholarly perspective on the topic. I feel like right now, at least, my best work is in the realm of lived experience, right? And engaging with not just my own lived experience, but the lived experiences of the subject matter of Black folks, and how that shows up. So I'm more like creative nonfiction more than anything. Although I do a lot, and I had to do, even with this book, a lot of research and a lot of scholarly work. I think that there is an opportunity for other Black scholars to take this topic, and there actually is. There are people that are doing this work. I'm thinking of Cleaver. I'm think with the Black Joy Project, and there are people that are out there like really doing their work. But I do think they need to be Black folks,
Mm-hmm.
because while you can even approach something from an academic, scholarly standpoint, the lens that you use to even do that work matters when it's something like this, which is the biggest problem with this idea of this white woman writing this book on trap feminism. Like there's a particular lens, cultural lens, that you just don't have to even be able to see it through, to even write about it from a scholarly perspective. And so I honestly, to answer your question, yes, I think this opens the conversation up, to look at Black joy in a more nuanced. It's not
Mm-hmm.
like, I tell people all the time, like, you can read my book and it's not going to be all spades games and electric slide. That
Mm-hmm.
piece is in there, but that is one piece of a larger conversation of all the myriad of ways that Black joy shows up.
Mm-hmm.
But I still think that that needs to be handled in a particular way, um,
Mm-hmm.
by someone who has that lived experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's giving me very much Bell Hooks. Would you say that she is
Mm.
among? Is she? Would you consider her one of your foremothers, or someone who I look at her books on love and the ways that Black people love in particular, and this seems to be following in that legacy, footsteps, so to speak?
I have
Has anyone made?
yes, they've said it. I've said it. I've heard it like all the time. And the thing is that I love bell hooks. I don't know if I necessarily connected my work like in the tradition of it, but I see it. And like with this book in particular, it has come up at least five 5 or 6 times from interviewers. I've even seen the book on the shelf next to, because I mean, we know she just recently passed, right? So like
Right.
on the shelf next to All About Love and Bone Black and like all of these books of hers, and it is and she's a Kentucky woman, and I'm born and raised in Kentucky, so
Oh, well, look at that.
yeah, like that connection to, my home state and all of that. I that's an honor to even hear. To have heard it as often means that my intention about this book being on the shelf that people grab periodically is underway, if that is the case, because I certainly have about at least 7 of her books on my shelf. I'm looking over here because that's the shelf. Um, yeah, like I have lots of her work, so that means a lot.
Oh, that's wonderful. So, I think as we close out, I would love for you to let folks know where are those spaces that you would love for them to pick up your book. And do you have any in-person, are you touring the book, and where are some spots that folks could possibly meet you in person to get a signed copy of your book?
Yes. So the book is available everywhere books are sold, as well as audiobook if that's your thing. Um,
Are you reading it?
I am reading it.
Oh,
I
that's so
am.
awesome.
I
Yes.
enjoyed it. That was so fun to do that. So Audible, all the audiobook vendors, Google Play, all of that. And wherever you buy your books, I prefer, if you can, to buy the book from an independent Black owned bookstore. And so there is Mahogany Books in the DC area. There is
That's where I
Harriet's
am.
in Philly. Yep,
Mhm.
Harriet's in Philly. We're near
Mhm.
me, and Uncle Bobby's in Philly also. So there's
That's
places
right.
that you can actually order online and have it shipped to you. Um, and I have a new book coming out September 13th. So I have to
That was
say
my
that.
next question. Yes.
So
So
that's coming
how are
up.
you doing this back to back? You have these books, September 13th. That's less than a year after this one coming out.
Um, yeah, it was a busy pandemic.
That's right. That's
Um,
right.
so like, yeah, those I think this book that's coming out though had been in the works a little bit. Like I'd been playing around with it. Black Joy really kind of really just came out of, it's one of those books that just comes out of my personal experience and then the timing of, what was going on in the world at the time. And so yeah, so then they came for mine. How to Heal, Healing from the Trauma of Racial Violence comes out September 13th. And I have new
Congratulations.
seasons of my podcast, Heart Talk with Tracey Michae'l. So if you're into
Yes.
podcasts, the new season is coming out in a couple of weeks. But you can go
Yes.
listen to some old episodes.
That's wonderful. And what's that website?
You TraceyMLewis.com is where is an entry point for all of that.
That's right. That's right. Well, it has been a pleasure. I think that I had to keep myself very focused because there's so many avenues in which I wanted to ask questions, and we could be on in this conversation for at least 3 hours, but that just means I have to bring you back. But because I'm particularly interested in the work that you're doing and that you do in with your other hats. And so Tracey, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for being a guest in the Black Writer Studio.
Thank you so much for having me.